Welcome to the Outthinker podcast. Each week, we talk with forward-looking strategists and innovators that are challenging the status quo, leading the future of business, and shaping our world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of the Outthinker Strategy Network. Gary Hamel is one of the world's most influential and iconoclastic business thinkers. He has worked with leading companies across the globe and is a dynamic and sought-after management speaker. Hamel has been on the faculty of the London Business School, one of my alma maters, for more than 30 years and is the director of the Management Lab. Gary has written 20 articles for the Harvard Business Review and is the most reprinted author in the review's history. His landmark books have been translated into more than 25 languages. His most recent bestsellers are Humanocracy and The Future of Management. In these volumes, Hamel presents an impassioned plea for reinventing management and lays out a practical blueprint for building organizations that are fit for the future. Fortune magazine describes Hamel as the world's leading expert on business strategy, and the Financial Times calls him a management innovator without peer. He has been ranked by the Wall Street Journal as the world's most influential business thinker and is a fellow of the Strategic Management Society and of the World Economic Forum. In his work, Gary has led transformational efforts in some of the world's most notable companies and has helped to create billions of dollars in shareholder value. He is one of the world's most sought-after management speakers on the topics of strategy, leadership, innovation, and change. I have been reading Gary's work for decades, and it surely is foundational in the tomes of the strategic dialogue that we are all building on. And we got a chance to sit down with him and talk about strategy. And in this podcast, he shares with us several things, including what strategic intent really is and why your strategy setting should begin with it. What his research shows are the 4 sources of breakthrough strategic ideas and the source of differentiating choices that will ultimately determine your competitive advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Hamel. Gary, as I've said in the introduction, I've been a huge fan and follower of your work, and it is great to have you with us. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to it.
So I like to open up with a question to just get people to know you personally. And so if you could complete the sentence for me, if you really know me, you know that. How would you complete that?
I have a passion for new ideas. I have a passion for teaching, and I have a passion for helping people in organizations do more than they thought possible.
I love that. Do more than they thought possible. So this is a podcast on strategy, and we have strategy thought leaders. And I ask the same question of all of them. They all give me a different answer. So whatever answer is right for you, what is your definition of strategy?
I think for me, strategy is really making choices, but also about setting a particular direction. Who are we becoming? And I think the most fundamental question I would argue, Kyan, for any group of senior leaders in any organization is the question, how over the next few years are we going to reinvent ourselves and reinvent the industry that we compete in? And so for me, strategy is fundamentally a point of view about the future. How do we think the world's changing? What is our place in that? What is our aspiration? But it starts from really having a sense of how we can shape the future. So we're kind of in the driver's seat rather than the passenger seat or standing beside the road as that happens.
And so when you think about strategy, I know you focus on business strategy, but you think about strategy beyond that. The way you described it seems like it could be applicable to other areas.
Sure. I think it's a question for any organization. For example, I've spent time working with churches, helping them think about what's the future of organized religion, for example. Every institution, particularly in a world of head-snapping change, every institution is standing on the precipice of irrelevance all the time. You are either reinventing yourself or you're falling behind. And this is in government, it's in religion, it's in business, it's in education. But what often happens is that institutions are changing more slowly than the world around them. And that's a recipe for irrelevance. That's why I put a lot of emphasis on having that point of view on where are we going to go next? How are we changing the world around us?
So again, I studied London Business School. I have read your work since I started getting interested in the topic. topic. There's so many contributions you've made, from computing to future, what matters now, leading the revolution. What would you say that you are most well known for? What concepts or ideas have been most adopted?
Well, as a matter of record, the articles that I'm most known for, I'm not going to remember kind of when I wrote these things, but it was a long time ago, probably 25 or 30 years ago. I wrote a piece called Strategic Intent. And the simple argument there was that no organization outperforms its aspirations. And often the best way to set strategy or to create strategy is to set a very ambitious goal, and then you work backwards from that. And I think that was a fairly radical idea at the time, because when I wrote that, a lot of people saw strategy as an exercise of how do you position yourself in a fairly familiar competitive landscape, right? You're in the supermarket industry, or you're making computers, or you're in the car industry, and you're deciding which segments and whether you over-index on differentiation versus low cost and so on. But there was very little talk about where aspiration plays in all of this, and I don't think at the time nobody was talking about stretch goals. We hadn't borrowed the language of NASA and moonshots, but I really sense that that's where you have to start. You start with an aspiration, and then you work backwards from that. Innovation is born in the gap between aspiration high and resources not so high. And that forces you to think in new ways. And what you see happen as companies grow and they become successful is that gap. That gap between aspiration and resources gets narrower and narrower. And pretty soon, a big Fortune 500 company is satisfied if they slightly outgrow the industry, if they don't give away market share, if they raise their gross margins by a half a percentage point. And incremental goals produce incremental thinking, produce incremental results. So I think that was definitely, I hope, seems that others regarded as a contribution. The second one was the piece that I also wrote with C.K. Prahalad on the core competence of the corporation. And that seems like such an obvious thing to talk about now, to ask this question: what fundamental capability are you building that is going to differentiate yourself, that is going to create barriers to entry, that is going to allow you to produce amazing products, that is extensible into new and adjacent markets? But at the time we wrote that, strategy was almost indistinguishable from marketing. There was very little thought on these deeper competencies and deeper expertise. Like today, you might think of Google and AI, for example. Strategy had really been born out of product marketing. And we thought that if you looked at companies that had enjoyed success over years and years and years, they were very intentional and very persistent in building quite complex capabilities that were combinations of technical knowledge, tacit human knowledge, systems, processes, and so on. And I think that idea has also kind of stood the test of time. If I give you a couple of very current examples, unless you follow Apple, many people might not know that Apple made a commitment now almost 15 years ago to become a world leader in designing their own silicon, which powers every digital device. Now, this is a very esoteric, demanding kind of competence. They started with a small acquisition, but just persistently over this last decade and more, they built out that capability. They would now be probably the third or fourth largest silicon designer in the world if that was kind of its own business. And now every single product, literally, I think every single product that Apple makes has Apple unique silicon in it, because they realize that this drives the functionality of the products. And if that is being done for you by Intel or Samsung or somebody else, it's going to be very hard to differentiate your products with undifferentiated silicon. Another example would be looking at the now more than a decade of really hard, painstaking work that Tesla has put in, both to its battery technology. It just is getting better and better and better at that, opening up a bigger and bigger cost divide and performance gap with their competitors. And of course, the work they've put into autonomous, or semi-autonomous is a better word, driving. And those capabilities, if you get a long head start in building one of these very difficult, deep technologies, it takes a long time for anybody to catch up. So I think those were two articles that have stood the test of time. A third one that maybe fewer people know, but I would argue is maybe the most important one I wrote, and it led to a book, was an article I wrote called Strategy's Revolution. And I don't want to claim I was the first to say this, but I was certainly one of the earliest people, and that was back in the 90s, some point, to basically look at strategy as an innovation problem. How do you reinvent the competitive space you're in rather than trying to fit in with some space somebody's already created? And most companies didn't see it that way. In fact, I think I argued, and I would argue today, that the idea of strategic planning is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as strategic planning. That's BS. There's planning, which is how do you lay out a sequence? How do you take some aspiration? How do you program it? What are you going to do for second, third? That's planning. And there's strategizing, which is building a foundation of new to the world insights, thinking deeply about where you could change the rules of the game, and then setting a North Star around that. And what was clear to me then, and I have to say, I think it's equally problem now. I think we made almost no progress on this, or little progress over the last 20 or 30 years, is that in most companies, there was a lot of work done done on planning, but very little deeply creative work on developing a portfolio of truly game-changing strategies. And I think that's kind of still where a lot of organizations are stuck.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense.
I'll just add this one thing. One of the core thoughts in Strategy is Revolution was you cannot create a strategy by having the same 10 or 15 or 20 people that have sat at the top of a company for the last decade having the same conversations with more or less the same data sets. It's never going to happen. And so you need to have a process for creating strategies far more open to new ideas and voices than what you typically find.
I love your idea of there being a marketplace for ideas internally and creating an openness for the best ideas to come out. One question we get a lot is how much should you be focused on the core versus the new and the options or Horizon 1, 2, 3, or whatever framework you want to use? How do you think about whether you are spending enough time thinking about the core and enough time thinking about the new?
Super good question. First of all, I would say you have to innovate everywhere. One of the things certainly that we've believed and did some early research on this, and nothing has changed my mind, is that very few of the incubators or accelerators that companies create produce much of anything. And we can go deeper on why that is. But if you have a core business that's 70, 80, 90% of your company, if you are incapable of evolving that, whatever you do in addition is likely to be marginal. Not always. Sometimes, like back to Apple, you create a whole new category called smartphones and your core business becomes kind of insignificant. That's a quite rare event. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it. We absolutely should. But I think you have to be able to evolve and innovate in your core business as you look for new pastures. And I think one of the big mistakes companies often make is they kind of just assume, okay, the core business, we've been in there for a decade or 2 or 3 or 10. There's very little more to be done. So what we really need to do is look somewhere else. And you should look somewhere else. But if you do not evolve the core and innovate there, whatever else you do is unlikely to be enough. The wrong assumption that we often make is that a mature business is mature because of some God-given law that, it's been around a long time. But there's no such thing as a mature industry. There's a lot of mature thinking in some industries. And in many industries, you see over time that the strategies of the leaders all converge. If I dropped you in a Safeway or a Kroger or whatever else, or I dropped you in a Marriott, a Hilton, or a Hyatt, could you tell me where I'd put you? And the answer is no. So over time, all the leaders of those companies, they're all reading the same trade rags. They all go to the same conferences. They're all talking to consulting companies who have a practice in their industry. Very dangerous, right? So if you're a bank, you're talking to banking consultants. That's the worst possible thing you can do if you want to innovate. There's other reasons maybe to do that. But if you want to innovate, golly, don't talk to somebody who spent the last 20 years serving clients in your industry. You have to open yourself to new ideas in the core business as much as anywhere else and challenge your team to say, if we had a clean sheet of paper, if we had no legacy, if we weren't trying to protect an installed base, if we weren't working against an existing product customer map, what will we do differently? What will we do that's new here?
Absolutely. I love that. The point of not abandoning the core because you want to move on to the new or sticking with the core because you don't want to look at the new. It is the result of the same trap. And the way out is evolving the core.
And, this question of what is core and non-core, I think is also kind of arbitrary. I don't know how you really decide that. If you start with deeper competencies, capabilities, you say, where else can we take those? Then you'll end up in a lot of places that might not be entirely logical, but Tesla building power systems for house, battery storage for home, it's a completely logical extension of what they've been working on. So it's is that a whole new business? Is that non-core? No, it's another branch on this tree that's planted with that deep capability. So let me take another example. Sometime this year, maybe next, Aldi, the German supermarket chain, is going to become the third largest supermarket in the United States, behind Walmart and Kroger. Kroger, Walmart, I don't know who comes first. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, right? To have done this in, quotes, a mature industry. And if you look at an Aldi store, in some sense, there's nothing fundamentally different from a Walmart, except they took a much smaller form factor. They have a much smaller selection. They've simplified the business. They get even more cost economies. They bet even bigger on private label. There's nothing there that Walmart couldn't have done. And so here you're going to have the third largest supermarket in the United States, who, by the way, wasn't born with the idea that we're a hypermarket, we're a superstore, and we have to sell hammers and potato chips, right? They said, no, we're a grocery store. We're going to be significantly lower cost even than Walmart. People have told you that's impossible. Walmart should have done it. And the reason they didn't is just about executive myopia and blindness and the inability to see beyond what is, but it has nothing to do with some entirely unique capabilities.
And when you see that myopia in your clients or companies that you work with. How do you address it? What do you say to leadership?
The first thing I say, Kyan, is you don't get to create strategy. That is not your job at the top of the company. There are not enough of you. You have too much of your emotional equity invested in the past. A lot of the decisions that need to be rethought or unwound are decisions you made, and you spend too much time trying to defend decisions that were made a decade ago because, they were yours. So I think if I take one step back, I don't think you can get differentiated results without a differentiated strategy. And I don't think you can build a differentiated strategy without differentiated insights. In other words, this is not just a hunch or a dream. You have to see, believe, know things that none of your traditional competitors see because of that self-induced blindness. And so for me, the beginning always of any process of creating strategy is to build a foundation of entirely new insights. What is it that customers really want? What is changing in their lives? What are their unarticulated needs? What are the frustrations they have? What are the new technologies on the fringe that are mostly being ignored in our industry? What's happening with geopolitics and government? And wherever you look, you're looking to find things that have the potential to open up a new horizon, open up a new opportunity that are being mostly ignored in your industry. And you're simply not going to find those insights talking the same old, same old. Even if you look at open innovation platforms and scientific problem solving, you find that more than half of the time, the toughest problems are solved by people who have no history in that discipline, because they could come at it orthogonally. They could look at it in a different way. They weren't bound, they didn't have the weight of precedent on them. And so if you want to create a game-changing strategy, I think you have to involve dozens, hundreds, better yet, thousands of people in an organization. You have to be looking for, what are the new insights? What do you see in the world around us that we could use as a lever to move in a new direction? And you have to build that foundation of insights, and then you can start to think about strategy. The other thing I would tell senior leaders, beyond the fact that you have to have way more people involved in this conversation and you need to spend a whole lot more time generating unique insights, I would also tell them that as a kind of personal discipline, you have to learn how to challenge what you already believe. And so whenever you have this reflex of, that's the way we've done it, like ask why. Often when I go and I worked in a new industry, one with which I wasn't very familiar, at some point fairly early on, some leader would say, Gary, let me tell you how our industry works. And I was always eager to learn that. But I always said, well, as far as you know, or for now, or until it doesn't. You simply cannot assume that there is some set of rules. And again, I think this is often missed, Kyan, more generally as we think about innovation. I'll say this quite strongly and categorically, and I think it's true, certainly from my experience. Any innovation process, whether it's for a new product, a new ad campaign, a new strategy, you have to start by deconstructing what you already believe. You have to take every for granted belief you have about whatever you're looking at, the customer, the channel, whatever. You have to take everything that you believe. And many of these beliefs are like fish in water. We're in it all the time. We don't even think about it. But you have to take every belief and you have to say, why? Is there an alternative? Let me give you an example. I was talking a few years back to a large group of business school deans. Typical business school, maybe they turn out somewhere between a couple hundred and 1,000 MBAs a year. It's not a big number. Maybe a few are more than that, but that's probably the range. So you take 100 leading business schools and you see that across those business schools, maybe they turn out 100,000 MBAs a year. Against the global demand for better quality leadership and management, the difference you're making in the world is so small it can't be measured. And most of them are going into organizations that already have plenty of these leaders anyway. And so I remember asking them, what would happen if we could do an MBA for $250? Sharp intake of breath. Instead of $100,000 or $150,000 to get through 2 years, what if we do it for $250? If they can do eye surgery in India for less than $100, obviously teaching is more complicated than surgery. Everybody knows that. Maybe. But why not? And so there was just an assumption that this is the way you deliver the product. And of course, now post-COVID, we're radically rethinking how we do education. But that was going to happen, COVID or not. The economics were simply there. And what I would call the Louis Vuitton version of higher ed, where people can afford to pay all this money, show up at Stanford, at Harvard, at the London Business School, that's always going to be, there's always going to be, man, it's a great product. But if you start by saying, my goal is to make as big an impact in improving the quality of management around the world, that is not the model you would choose. That challenged a lot of thinking. As business school faculty going on, becoming dean and whatever, that's just the way you think about it.
Does that mean that you start then with what we began our conversation with, which is kind of the why or the purpose, the mission, the strategic intent, that you start with that and then untangle, or do you rethink that?
Interestingly, I think strategic intent is the outcome. It's not where you start. It might be. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur and something inside of your head has been sparked you're Elon Musk and saying, our goal is to dramatically accelerate the transition to renewable energy. You might just like start that and put that out there as an entrepreneur. If you're in a much larger company with more tradition-bound leaders, probably that's not a good place to start. I often see organizations do that. Some leaders say, we're going to become a solutions company. Okay, like what's that? Nobody knows what it is. And in fact, in the past, and I think it's like a huge mistake, and you'll know, we tried to make a distinction between strategy formulation and strategy implementation, execution. And so the assumption was a small group of people somewhere goes off and sets the strategy. We don't know how they did it exactly, what they learned, how many options they generated, what they rejected. But at some point, they come to these tablets of stone, aka a PowerPoint chart, and they say, like, here's the strategy and blah, blah, blah. Everybody else in the organization is like, why? How did you get there? And so you spend now a long time backfilling and trying to explain to the organization, like, what do we mean when we say solutions? What do we mean when we say premium? What do we mean whatever? And typically you'll find out that those things have not been very thought through. You're not really clear on where you put your shovel in. Where would you begin if you want to build this sort of organization? So my preference and the sort of work we've done, and I can give you a few examples, is we would start with a very wide conversation across the company. And we'd start by trying to build out a foundation of insights. And we have some, I think, pretty well-honed tools for doing that grew out of research. So one of the questions I got interested in many, many years ago was, where do new game-changing strategies come from? So I went and talked. I talked to Anita Roddick at the Body Shop. This tells you it was a long time ago, right? I talked to Michael Dell. I talked to Richard Branson. I talked to Mark Andreessen, who invented the first browser, right? And trying to understand, we all live in the same world with the same data. How do some people see opportunities that other people never see? Are they just gifted in some unique way? They have the strategic equivalent of perfect musical pitch. And of course, when you dig in, you find out, no, these are not some superheroes. And often they don't have a second vision. They can't repeat whatever got them there in the first place. It was kind of intuitive, somewhat of a lucky accident, but that doesn't make them a strategy genius, right? They're not going to find the next one after that. But as we tried to understand where those ideas came from, what was clear was there was 4 perceptual lenses that were super important. Just as if, let me give you an example. If you have a telescope and I don't, that doesn't make you any smarter, but you can see things I can't. And what was clear is these entrepreneurs, these innovators, more by just kind of accident, but they had a way of looking at the world around them. And they're quite simple. One was they were contrarians. Every industry Richard Branson ever looked at, he said, how do we turn this thing upside down? How do we challenge the status quo? That's just like who he is. That's how he thinks. But you take whatever everybody else takes for granted and you're like, what happens if we turn that upside down? So that ability to question unexamined assumptions, you do that and you start to generate new insight. Second is that innovators are very good, not at predicting the future, but they have a wide angle lens. They're always looking for the trends, the discontinuities that are gathering speed, but are not yet really noticed by anybody else. So, for example, Amazon, with its history in web infrastructure and the huge infrastructure it built out and trying to do this in a very efficient way, it saw the potential power of cloud computing before any of the traditional computer companies saw it, who should have been there first. And so they're looking at something small, growing. Wow, can we create a marketplace for computer applications for software as a service? And the same we created a marketplace for goods and services. Yes, we can. So a second thing you learn how to do is you become a novelty addict. You're searching for the new. What's changing? What's accelerating? What are people not noticing yet? A third thing you found in all of these innovators, as we were talking about earlier, they never think about their business as products and services. They think about it as these deeper competencies, not only theirs, but others that may be around the world. And how do we combine those in new ways? So they look at, like, here's a giant box of Lego bricks made from strategic assets, from competencies that are there in our organization around the world. How do we recombine them in ways to do something nobody has thought about before? And finally, and probably most importantly, what all of these innovators have in common is a lot of empathy, a lot of sense of how are the incumbents making life difficult for customers, or what are the needs they have that they can hardly articulate but are mostly being ignored. And so what we do in our work is we can now do all this online and you can involve thousands of people very easily. We are literally asking people, what do you see changing in the world? Why do you think that might be important for us? How fast is it changing? Give us the data. And how could we use that trend, that discontinuity, as a lever to upend industry rules? Or we'll ask them, what are the emerging needs you see in customers? What are the frustrations they have? And there's all kinds of tools and different ways to get into the surface. But for me, that is always the starting point. I want to build hundreds of strategic insights that are novel, that are grounded in real research and looking at the world. And then you start to say, okay, as we start to combine these together, what are the opportunities that we might see? And again, you can do this today almost algorithmically. We have some quite fun tools for throwing showing up a technology discontinuity and emerging needs something else and saying like, well, at the intersection, what do you see? And literally in a day or two, you can generate hundreds of strategic options in this way. Another thing I certainly learned living in Silicon Valley, Kyan, is that every year, thousands of companies get funded here. And out of 1,000, one or two will become unicorns. Maybe 100 will survive beyond their Series A financing. And so if you're a CEO and you want the next Uber or you want the next Instagram or whatever it may be, you have to create a pretty large portfolio of compelling strategic options. And then you can start to rank them, to think about them, to run experiments. And to do that, you have to create the insights first. But otherwise, you have strategies that are not grounded on anything. It's just somebody's, brain fart. It's amazing to me, as simple as that logic is, that your chance of landing on a truly game-changing strategy is arithmetically determined by the number of potential strategic options you create in the first place. That logic is simple, it's impeccable. Every venture capitalist understands it. Most organizations still today do not have any disciplined, ongoing process for generating hundreds or thousands of new strategic options every year. And so, you end up with a very small set. They don't have any process for generating those insights, for capturing them, for making them available to the whole organization, for helping people process them, think about what might come out of that. So it's a very chaotic, undermanaged process with few truly new ideas in play. And that's why the bigger the company, the worse this is in my experience. If you look at the 100 largest companies in the United States, they've gotten too content. The strategy process, whatever they call it, has become too bureaucratized. It is not creative at its core, and you find yourself missing the future again and again. Let me give an example of something we did with a large global brand a few years ago. We took about 3,000 people. We trained them with a MOOC, with an online course. We trained them how to spot industry orthodoxies, how to challenge conventionalism. We trained them how to spot unarticulated emergent needs, how to spot new trends and discontinuities. And so over a period of weeks, these people generated thousands of insights. And they could all rank them, right? That seems really profound. That seems trivial. That's really data-driven. That's maybe just a hunch. We could start to cluster them into different categories. We got people to rank them, what seems most profound. Now you have a big set of insights. And then we started to ask people, find the insights that really strike you as new and fresh, and think about where that leads. What's the opportunity that you see there? So back to my example, you see ability to deliver education digitally. You're working in a business school somewhere, and you say, you know what? We ought to have 100,000 students. Why shouldn't we do that? That's an opportunity. And again, all of this is visible. It's all on the platform. Everybody can see it. So you're generating hundreds, and in this case, I think they generated 9,000 strategic options. Now, they're all peer-reviewed. We had 10,000 peer reviews. And that happens algorithmically. Hey, Gary, here's 5 new ideas. Can you rank them, review them today, against a few criteria? Is it doable? Is it radical? And so on. But the real power in doing this, Kyan, I've learned, is not the individual idea. The real power is the patterns that you start to discover. We did maybe one of the first real open strategy projects in the world for Nokia, when Nokia was a very small company back in the early 90s. And we got hundreds of employees together. We said, what are the new insights? How would you change the rules if you want to challenge, at that time, Motorola, Siemens, whoever it was? Out of that came hundreds of strategic options. But when you looked at them, you saw 3 very interesting themes, clusters. There's a whole cluster around how do you take the phone beyond voice? So in the early 90s, they were talking about how to use it as a credit card, as a payment mechanism. How do you do photos? How do you do texting? They could see all of that. And so that was a big theme. Another theme was, how do you make this a lifestyle device? At that time, these things were hundreds of dollars. They were for business people, professional people. They said, no, every kid in the world is going to have one of these things, just about. That was a very fresh perspective. And then the final insight was recognizing how fast this industry could grow. And if you want to lead it, you have to help provide the telecommunication companies. You have to give them a turnkey package that allows them to put up the infrastructure, to sell the phones, to do the billing, the whole thing. And so that was another business. So they put this, I think, in their annual report. I'll have to go back, 93, 94, sometime. 3 simple legs, more than voice, lifestyle device, and all-in-one kind of solution. That and the strategic intent, what's at the heart of this? Like, what's the essence of the essence as you think about the opportunity? Early 1990s, the strategic intent was, this will be the remote control for life. So ask yourself if the smartphone has become the remote control for your life. Now, of course, what happened with Nokia, all those wonderful young people I worked with at the time, they were all in their early 30s, immensely ambitious there in the cold north of Finland. 10 years later, they were all very wealthy, or as wealthy as you can become in Finland. globally famous. Nokia was being celebrated as the best managed tech company in the world, and they thought we have this thing figured out. So never again, despite some urgings, never again did they go back to the whole organization and say, guys, now this time we're not challenging Siemens and Motorola and whatever. We're going to challenge ourselves. We need the same huge burst of new insights, new creative thinking, and so on. Never happened. If you don't do that, the strategic intent, the aspiration is not tethered to anything. And instead, strategy set by a group of industry stalwarts who were captive to their own beliefs, and the rest is kind of history. But, they created for a while something that was worth, I don't know, $50-60 billion, not too bad.
Yeah. But they had in their hands this future that we're now experiencing.
So when you start with insights, you build strategies, you look at the themes, the threads, you say, guys, what does all this add up to? How do you capture all of this? And back to our conversation kind of about formulation versus implementation. Once you finally say that, you say, here's the 3 legs of our strategy, lifestyle, devices, whatever it is. Here's the overall goal. Everybody knows exactly how you got there. They saw the whole movie. Okay, we looked at this set of options. We did this peer review. We processed them. And because every one of these themes has inside it dozens of peer-reviewed ideas that you've already looked at, it's not hard. How do you get started? There's no gap between formulation and implementation. It's obvious. Like now we've chosen a theme. We take all the ideas. We can rank them by how do they build in terms of degree of difficulty, or they have some path dependency and we have to do this before that. And so you go rather than like, so what do those guys mean when they talked about this? And what does it mean in my part of the organization? And by the way, where did this come from?
It came from us. It came from me.
It's crazy to me that this is not the way strategy is done everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not that complicated. I mean, it does take some hard work and there's a few things you have to get right, but strategy making should be a broad participative sport. I remember when Apple went to Intel and gave them the chance to make the chips for the mobile phone. Intel said no. And talking about that quite a bit later, Paul Otellini, I don't know if he was the CEO at the time, whenever that would have been, 2005, 6, when Apple was getting ready to launch. But explaining this decision later, he said, this is like a direct quote. He said, the iPhone turned out to be 100 times more successful than anyone thought. And you go, really? You take what was already by then the most ubiquitous electronic device in the world, the phone, and then Apple puts its magic on it. Like I'm sure they showed you a prototype. I had the first iPhone, one of the very first iPhones. I'd flown into the UK. I was having an interview with a journalist from The Economist. I showed him this phone, and like in a minute, the guy was giggling like he was 6 years old. Like I'm sure Apple showed you something. This wasn't just blind. So my question is, okay, what if that decision you'd have asked 100 or 1,000 people across Intel? So CEOs are not the ones to create strategy. I would say they are not the ones to judge or evaluate strategy. That is something that has to be done by the crowd in a much more open, participative way. I'm not even sure they're the ones that should resource it. I think there's some very creative ways today using crowdfunding to decide how much to put. But that's the myth, right? The myth is that CEO equals strategist in chief. It's a bad myth.
Yeah, it's gone wrong many times. And if you can get more brains to work together, especially brains that are looking from more perspectives, as you say, and closer to the ground and the line of sight, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's just a more exciting framing of strategy. And that's one thing I've really appreciated about your work is you really humanize strategy and make it something personal, creative, and something that everyone can be a part of. So I've got tons of other questions, but I know we're reaching the top of our time with you. So let me close just by asking, how can people connect with you and learn from you and engage with you? And what are you working on next?
Well, you can find me at GaryHamel.com. You can always email me at Gary@GaryHamel.com. And you can find me on the usual social media platforms. I'm Prof. Hamel on Twitter. So yeah, please reach out. If you've done something interesting around strategy, you have a question, I will definitely engage. I think in terms of what I'm working on next, having spent a lot of my life thinking about how do you innovate around business models, we're now thinking about how do you iterate around the management models. So how do you build organizations that are entrepreneurial at their core, that never take refuge in denial, that change faster than the world around them. And for that, bureaucracy has to die. That's a pretty big challenge to take. And I think the even bigger thing, and I don't know kind of whether I'll have any real impact here, but I certainly have a lot of heart for thinking about this, is capitalism is on the back foot. Capitalism is, at least some would say, is in crisis. And when you look at the data, the vast majority of people around the world now say that capitalism does more harm than good, which is an incredible thing to say. To say it has issues or problems or whatever, but to say it is now doing more. By the way, I don't agree with that, but I do believe there's a perception, and it's not all unjustified, when you look at the growing concentration of corporate power. when you look at the enormous gaps between CEO compensation, first-line compensation, when you look at the growing income inequality around the world, when you look at the long succession of scandals, there's a reason that capitalism is having a crisis. And I think we have to face up to that. ESG, a few changes at the margin in governance, as important as sustainability is, as important as promoting more opportunity inside organizations for disadvantaged groups, that is only scratching the surface. And there's a lot more that's going to be done. And if it's not, we may end up through regulation, through other means, kind of killing the golden goose. So that for me is now a challenge. How do leaders, particularly business leaders, get on the front foot here? And like vague statements about, oh yeah, purpose is important, that's almost risible, and how trivial that is.
By 2050, we will be carbon neutral, or yeah.
I mean, of course that's important, but it is the smallest down payment on really what needs to be done, I think.
It really is. It's a unifying, coordinating force that we can rally for good.
Well, the largest institutions in the world today are the least trusted. Substantially less than 50% of people trust big government or big business to do the right thing. And again, not without reason. And I think this is a different conversation, but one of the things that's happened is over the last, quite a long time, in both government and business, power has moved to the center. Washington has far more power today or Brussels or London in the UK, but government has become far more centralized. Business has become far more centralized. More rules, more layers, and so on. And almost inevitably, as something becomes centralized, trust is going to go down. Because I can tell you, the people in Washington know nothing about my life or my neighbors. They know nothing about the problems right here, or very little about the problems right here on the ground. So by definition, as power gets centralized, I have less ability to influence that. My share of voice goes down. The policies that come down are less and less likely to be attuned to local circumstances. They're probably going to be wrong as often as they are right. I think it is impossible to have highly centralized institutions and high trust. It's impossible for those things to coexist, I think. So I think we have some interesting challenges in front of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Gary, thank you so much. Again, I'd love to dig in deeper. Thank you for spending the time to unpack with us. And yeah, I can see how your lifelong exploration of these questions can lead us towards a unifying vision in which organizations can work for humanity. It's really a pleasure to get to hear from you directly about that.
Thank you, Kyan, so much for the opportunity. And I invite your listeners to get in touch if they'd like to take the conversation further.
Yes, we will as well. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Ness, our editor, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next week with another episode of Outthinkers.